Whole text. We're going to continue in this series of God is Calling, and yet my take on it, my approach is going to be a little bit different this morning. You can see the title out of the box, and this way I'm approaching this text is a little bit different this morning. I don't know if the theme or the message that I share with you this morning will how it will speak to you this morning. I just want to say that as I was studying and preparing this text this week, this message spoke to me. These were words and a passage and insights that the more I got into it, the more it spoke to me, and in kind of deep ways. So I'm preaching to myself, I guess, this morning, as much as I am preaching to anybody. But it's the story of the conversion of Paul. And I want to begin by a little bit of reflection. A number of years ago, in one of the churches I served, I had a lady that used to love to bring me riddles. And almost every week she'd bring me a riddle and say, I'm going to give you to next week to see if you can figure it out. Very seldom did I ever figure them out. And I don't remember all of them, but I remember one riddle she brought me. She told me this riddle. She said there was a man who lived in this high-rise apartment complex, 20 stories high, and every day he'd come home from work and he would punch the button number 10 and ride up to the 10th floor. Then he would get out and walk up to his apartment on the 20th floor. Except every once in a while, he would get on the elevator and he'd punch the 20th button and ride all the way up to his apartment on the top floor. And the question is, why did he do this? What accounted for that behavior? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I couldn't figure it out. And she came back the next week, and she explained that this man was a very small stature. He was short. And so on most days when he came home from work and got on the elevator and he reached up, he could only reach up to the 10th button. But on the days that it rained, she said, he would take his umbrella to work. And then he would come home on those days and he'd get on the elevator and he'd use his umbrella to reach up and touch the button on the 20th floor and ride it all the way up to the top. And I told her I would have never have figured that out. And she said to me, Pastor, you just simply need to learn to think outside of the box. And that's what I've titled this sermon this morning, is outside of the box. What does it mean for us as individuals? What does it mean for us as a church? What does it mean for us as a denomination? To start thinking a little bit outside of the box. This is a story in Acts chapter 9, the story of a dramatic conversion of Paul. A man who was extremely sincere but going in the wrong direction. He was persecuting the people of God, running from the plan of God, totally against what it seemed that God was doing in the world through Christ, until he had this dramatic kind of conversion. It was an experience we read about, and it says as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and he heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And this call, this reaching out of God, intervening into the life of Saul, changed his life. It changed the then church and the very nature of the church in that day, and it literally changed the world. And as I look through this text and look at the experience of Paul and his call and his conversion, a kind of a theme began to emerge. And I've thought about this, and I've thought about this, and I've prayed about this. But here is the main theme that has come to me this week. I'm going to share this, and then I'm going to ask you to repeat it. I actually meant to send this to Trish and ask her to put it up on the screen, but I totally forgot. So we're just going to repeat it. But here is the theme that stands out to me, that God calls the unlikely to do the implausible through the care and the support of the apprehensive. Think about that. God calls the unlikely to do the implausible through the care and the support of the apprehensive. I want I want us to think about that as we get into this text, and I want you to repeat it. God calls the unlikely, can you say that?
God calls the unlikely.
To do the implausible. Through the care and support of the apprehensive. Okay, let's think about that in light of this text this morning. Let's break this down a little bit. First of all, God calls the unlikely. We read about the unlikely in verses 1 through 9. About Saul, who was breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples, actually went to the priest and asked for letters to the synagogues in Damascus so that if he found anyone who belonged to the way, anyone belonged to this group of Christians, he might take them and put them in prison. Here was a guy who was unlikely to be a great servant of God. We think of Paul, of all the people that God could have chosen. Surely he would have chosen someone who had been studying their Bible, maybe who had been a disciple of Christ, maybe been a follower, an original follower of Christ, someone whose heart at least was supportive and learning and was a part of the Christian fellowship. But God chooses the most unlikely of all people, and a person who's actually rebelling against God and rebelling against the church and persecuting the church. And yet he sees this light from heaven that literally blinds him. He loses his voice. He's left, and the people around him who see all of this are left speechless. They hardly know what to do. They can't believe what's going on here. They don't know what to think. And again, it reminds me and the emphasized to me, and I hope to you, that God oftentimes uses the people who are least expected to do great works for Him. And yet, why should we be so surprised at this? When we look throughout the Scriptures, we see time and time again that God has done this very thing. You remember the story of David and Goliath? And the Goliath was taunting the armies of Israel, and that all the mighty men were trembling in fear. And at that time, King Saul couldn't find anybody to go out and fight against Goliath. And yet here this young shepherd boy comes forward. And what do the people do? They look at David and they say, he is as unlikely to be able to fight this giant. In fact, that was a kind word. He is just a boy. You are just a youth. This man has been a warrior since his youth. You're not even fully grown. They tried to put the armor on David and it didn't fit. It just hung down on him. It was overbearing him. He said, I can't fight anybody like this. And he goes out to fight the Goliath, who had this mighty sword with a slingshot and some rocks. And of all the unexpected people to think, this is the one whom God is going to use. And how many times do we sometimes look to others in the fellowship of the church or in the community, and we're thinking, God's going to do something great, but I doubt it's going to be through him. I don't think it's going to be through her. They don't have the talents. They don't have the gifts. They don't have the experience. They don't have the depth of wisdom. They don't have the charisma. They don't have the power. They don't have the prestige. They don't have the training. We can go on and on and on. And yet God's not looking for people like that. God is looking for people whose heart can be turned to Him in full of passion, and God can use them because these are people who, when encountering God, give themselves fully to Him and become dedicated and available to what God wants to do. God frequently calls the unlikely, and sometimes we look at them and we say, we don't even want to give these people a chance. We're not going to get behind these people to do anything. Even though God may be calling them, we are the apprehensive sometimes. At least I am. I'll have to admit, sometimes I'm very apprehensive. And yet when I look further in this story, it seems that God calls the unlikely to do the implausible. And it says in Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias, and the Lord called to him in a vision. He said, Ananias. And he said, the Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. In a vision he has seen a man named Ananias coming and placing his hands on him to restore his sight. And he goes on to explain to him, he said, this man is going to be my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. Now the last part of that phrase, to proclaim my name to the people of Israel, that would have been okay to those who were listening in that day. But when he said, I am choosing this man to go forth and to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and to their kings, the initial response of the people of that day would have been, why? Why would you want to do that? I mean, when the church first started, it was a group of Messianic Jews. It was a group of Jewish people who were followers of Christ, and they grew up and they were worshiping in the synagogue. And now all of a sudden, we've got this message and this person that's been antagonistic towards the church, and now we're wanting to launch some kind of mission to the Gentiles and to their kings. Is that really a good idea? Why would we want to do that? And so we see, coupled with this first component that God sometimes calls the unlikely, He calls to do the implausible. He calls them to a mission, into a ministry that sometimes in our own mindset we're thinking, is that really a good idea? I mean, now, really, why would we want to do that? Why would we want those kind of people as a part of our fellowship? Why would we want to spend effort and time and money and get behind some kind of effort to reach out to these people? Aren't we just happy with the kind of people we have and the ministry that we have and the things we're doing? And a couple of weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago, you remember, we looked at the life of Jonah and how he was called to go to Nineveh, the great city. And instead of choosing to do that, he fled from the Lord and he got on a ship and he headed in the exact opposite direction because he didn't want to reach out to the people of Nineveh. He didn't want to have anything to do with them. And when he heard God knocking on the door of his heart and saying, I think this is a good idea for you to go reach out to these people, he was saying, I don't want to do that, and he fled and he went in the wrong way. And he wanted nothing to do with the mission that God was calling upon his heart. And sometimes we see God, I think, raising up, lifting up people who we would least expect. This guy really is going to do something for God. And then they tell us what's on their mind. They share with us kind of the vision that God's giving them. And we say, oh, really? Is that really a good idea? Do we really want to do that? It's kind of like the people of Samaria in Jesus' day. And Jesus engaged the woman at the well. And the disciples are going, why is he talking to this woman? And especially this Samaritan woman. I mean, is this really a good idea? And yet Jesus, in his own example, is saying, I go to people whom you don't even accept or people whom you don't even want to reach out to do a mission that seems implausible, that I might reach out and bring others into this great family known as the family of faith or the family of God. So God is calling the unlikely to do the implausible, and interestingly enough, He wants them to do this ministry through the care and support of the apprehensive. That's what happens here. It's kind of amazing. These very people that Paul had been persecuting, all of a sudden now he's blind, he's mute, and he goes and he has this vision of a man by the name of Ananias. And God is laying on the heart of this man Ananias to go to Paul and to minister to him. And yet it says in verse 13, Lord, Ananias answered, I have heard many reports about this man and all the harm he has done to your people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. And yet God had something very specific in mind in leading Paul to Ananias and leading Ananias to Paul. It says in verse 17, Then Ananias went to the house and entered in, and he placed his hands on Saul, and he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately something like scales fell from Saul's eyes, and he could see again. And he got up and he was baptized, and after taking some food he regained his strength. And then it was shortly after that he launched his mission. Isn't it interesting that the very people who Saul was railing against and trying to prison, that very same group of people were going to be the community for him for healing and forgiveness and care and support and grace. And the very people who had been so apprehensive about him, we've heard of this guy. This guy is bad news. We're afraid of this guy. We're apprehensive about this guy. We don't want to get messed up with him. The very people that had been so apprehensive towards Saul are called to rise above their fears and to step out in faith and to offer care and support and prayers for healing, that he might be brought back to a place where he can be restored and that he can launch out into a ministry which is literally going to change the church and is really going to change the world. This was really an experience of healing both for Paul and for Ananias and the then early Christian community as they embraced each other and now endorsed each other and worked together. They didn't go off in separate ways. They were brought together for this great work of the kingdom. So we see God calling the unlikely to do the implausible through the care and the ministry of the apprehensive. And so when we think about that, what does it all mean? And I got thinking about this back to the riddle, which my friend shared with me so many years ago, and it means we've come to the point where we need to think outside the box. We've come to the point where we need to take risks in one another, where we need to rise up sometimes above our apprehension and provide care and support to others. It means that we need to take chances on people. And we need to be supportive of ideas which seem strange sometimes to us, because I think sometimes people come forward with plans or thoughts or prayers or ideas or visions, and we're going, really? This person, this is who we're going to get behind? And they want to do what? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. We don't want to get behind that. But sometimes God is choosing people whom we would least expect, people who from our perspective are unlikely, to do the implausible and to do great things for Him. I share just a couple of stories, and I share these not in any kind of indicting way, but just in hopefully thought-provoking ways. It's so very interesting, and these are conversations with I and a number of other Methodist clergy have had throughout the years, a couple of situations, that how we need to come to the point where we're willing to take chances on people and ideas and get behind them even though we're reluctant or apprehensive. I guess it was about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, a young man who was a youth director at one of our churches at First Methodist in downtown Oklahoma City. The pastor there had a daughter, and this youth director fell in love with his daughter and actually got married. They married each other. But this youth director kind of had a vision of going out and starting a new church, a new kind of church that would have a little different kind of emphasis and would really put its emphasis on specifically on evangelism, and it would really target a certain segment of the community, a certain segment of the population. And he really felt like God was calling him to that. And interestingly enough, he went to his district superintendent and to the bishop at the time and tried to share his vision, his thoughts with the conference get behind. And what he was given was a lot of grief and a lot of no's. One, you're not far along enough. He wasn't even confirmed in the candidacy program for ministry. He had never served a church. He had never gone to the church planting school. That was a big deal back then. Everybody who was going to plant a church in the United Methodist Church had to be a graduate of the church planting school and things like that. Didn't have his theological training complete. I mean, he was an unlikely candidate. And then what he was talking about of doing kind of a specialized ministry and targeting a certain area of ministry, that's just not the way Methodists launched churches, especially back in that day, because every church was seen to be a generalist church serving the entire population, the entire community and everything. So it didn't fit our model, it didn't fit our style, it didn't fit really the understanding that they had in that day in terms of background and training and people being prepared to do these types of things. And so our bishop and the cabinet basically said, no, you are too unlikely and the ministry is too implausible. And they were apprehensive that he even had these kind of thoughts, and they basically said no. And so a young man by the name of Craig Rochelle went out and launched a thing called Life Church, which amazingly today, and this is just flat out statistics, in all of the connected various points through satellite and television and things like that today, there are more people in the state of worship in Oklahoma worshiping in Life Church on Sunday morning than there is in the aggregate congregation of United Methodist in the entire state. And you cannot believe the number, even leaders in our church now, who reflect back on that era, and I think that era is changing significantly, but have reflected back on that era in the life of a denomination and said, why couldn't we have taken a chance? Why couldn't we who were apprehensive lend some care and support to one who seemed, albeit unlikely, to do something that was implausible, and try to embrace this new direction in a way that would give us the context of support within the traditions which we hold dear and near, and yet be open to a new wind of the Spirit to do a kind of a targeted ministry to reach people who just don't seem to be connecting to the style in which we're doing. And yet we miss that realm of opportunity, and there's been so much discussion among other clergy and leaders today of how we now need to come to the point where we will look to those who are unlikely and are called to do something implausible, and even though we're apprehensive, maybe we will embrace and get behind some of the thoughts that they have. It's interesting, when I was back in seminary, there was a similar kind of experience down in Texas through a church known as Church of the Redeemer, and it was a grand, beautiful church in the Episcopal tradition in the heart of Houston, Texas, that was dying and declining and going downhill. It was down to about 45 people worshiping in the Church of the Redeemer, and there was a priest that was entering into his fourth quarter of ministry by the name of Graham Polkingham. And the diocese had decided that this church is going to close, this church is dying. And they sent Graham Polkingham to the Church of the Redeemer with the interesting task to bury the church and close the church. They said, it won't be long, the rest of the people will die off. It won't be long, and the church will be ready to close. We just want you in now kind of your closing stages of ministry to go and be with this church and their dying stages of ministry. And Graham Polkingham went down there and started visiting with the people and walking through the neighborhood and meeting the people in the neighborhood and realizing that this was a field that was ripened to harvest. Remember Jesus' words, how he said he looked out and he saw people as sheep without a shepherd, and Graham Polkingham said, these are people who are sheep without a shepherd. They just need someone to love them. They need someone to shepherd them. They need someone to care for them. This is a field that is ripe for harvest, and Jesus said, we need to send the workers into the harvest. Where are the workers who will go through? And Graham Polkingham began praying, and he began walking through the streets of that neighborhood and walking around that building and praying and soliciting, and he got some others who came and started praying with them. And then an amazing thing happened, not only in the life of that church, but in the life of the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Texas, as they began to see a revival kind of spirit break out within that life of that church. And people began connecting with people in that very neighborhood. And people who were unlikely to be Episcopalians began giving their life to Christ and coming in and joining in the fellowship of that church. And the church began to grow in a kind of a revival spirit. And I meant to bring it this morning, and I was going to get into my cabinet an album in the late 80s that I purchased. It's an album of music by the Church of the Redeemer Choir that has over 120 people in that choir, then doing their music ministry, their renewal ministry, to groups way beyond their borders. 120 in the choir, you can imagine the congregation. And here was a congregation in the minds of the leaders of the church that was unlikely to do anything but just hang on Just hang on, excuse me. For the next years, priest who wasn't really likely to do anything, but just hang on in his latter years as he moved into retirement. And in their wildest imaginations, they didn't have in mind that the church would be renewed, that the church would be filled with the Spirit, that ministry would start taking place, that people would start coming to the Lord, that revival would start breaking out. And yet, amazingly, the implausible began to happen. And all of a sudden, those who were doubters and apprehensive began to realize, we should have gotten behind this guy way before now. We should have been caring and supporting and renewing this vision and supporting this vision. Graham Polkingham in his story, and I think it was called They Left Their Nets, was the book he finally wrote about his experience, how they left their nets and went engage themselves into the life of the community. He talks about how, when he first started sharing with his denominational leaders, he said, hey, I think there's hope for this congregation. I think God is doing something here. I think God has something still in mind for this. They said, don't you remember? We sent you there to bury that church. We sent you there to close that church. What are you talking about? Renewal and such. And they were so apprehensive that anything positive could happen. And yet it became a tremendous story of growth and honoring God and reaching out and mission to the community. And I don't know why any of this would surprise me as a United Methodist. When we think back to a fellow by the name of John Wesley, anybody remember him? And we go back to the Church of England, and here's John Wesley, a young priest of the Church of England whose heart was strangely warmed in an experience at Aldersgate listening to Luther's preface to the Epistles of the Romans, and his heart was caught with the grace of God. And he, very similar to some of these modern day stories, starts going back into the local parishes and sharing with the denominational leaders and sharing his vision of taking this good news of Jesus Christ into the fields and into the workplace and into the prisons and into the coal mines and on the streets and into the poorest neighborhoods and all of these places. And he was dubbed by the leaders of his own church, this guy's an enthusiast. We think of the word enthusiasm being a positive thing today. That was a negative term. People, when they first started talking about the Methodist movement, that was a kind of a negative connotation in their day. These people are enthusiasts. That wasn't a word of endearment. That was a way of saying, this guy's unlikely. We don't know what's wrong with this guy. He's talking about personal conversion and people being saved and all this carrying on that goes on in his services and his commotion. This guy's unlikely to do anything really proper or effective for our church. And now, can you believe it? He actually wants to conduct services out in fields. He wants to do services down there where the coal miners are coming out and to do some kind of religious service. He wants to go into a prison and do a religious service. This guy wants to do the implausible. We can't do that. And literally, you read the early journals of Wesley, he was kicked out of almost every Anglican church he went into. I mean, it was just kind of amazing. There's one entry in his journal which I especially love. He said, preached in Nottingham on Sunday morning, asked not to come back. Went to another church, so told I was not invited back there again. I mean, he was rejected by the apprehensive. And amazingly, the very people who could have offered him care and support, those who were apprehensive of the Anglican Church of that day and could have offered him care and support of this young person who was unlikely, wanting to do the implausible, they literally ran him out of the church, and what emerged was a movement known as Methodism, which swept into the United States. And then they began doing crazy things too. They began riding around on horses, Can you imagine? Is that any way to start a church? That's not the way you do church planning. You go and you build a beautiful cathedral, and if you build it, people will come. That's not how the early Methodists do it. They went around on horses in the weather and the rain and the hail and all of this type of stuff, and they carried sermons in their backpack, and they would go into a community, and it may be inclement weather or whatever, but they'd get a crowd and they'd start preaching, and people would gide them and ridicule them, etc. But when they were done, they'd have baptisms in the river. It was the unlikely, doing the implausible, finally through a group of people who organized themselves and said, we will just start a new work and we will care and support and stand behind these people. And the Methodist movement in the United States was launched. And some people, some historians actually say that given the moral decline, the social decay, the corruption that was going on in England that day, it was really the revival of the Methodist Church that literally pulled England out of the morass and social decay that it was in, as people began to touch the lives of those who were longing and hurting and needing and seeking a new relationship with God. So what does all this mean? What is the next chapter? What is the next chapter of the church in America? What is the next chapter for the United Methodist Church? What is the next chapter for us as a congregation? The honest truth is I don't really know. But I do know this as I look at this text and the way God has worked in powerful ways throughout the Scripture, and it is so evident in this 9th chapter, that we, and I'm including myself in this, that we the apprehensive, maybe you aren't, but I have at times, we the apprehensive need to be open in the Spirit to care for and support the unlikely in their attempt to do the implausible for the kingdom of God. Or maybe, like my parishioner said some 35 years ago, Alan, and maybe she is speaking to all of us, you're going to have to learn to think outside the box. Wow. It's a message I'm still thinking about today. God bless. Thank you.